Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport bus at Fort Carson with nothing but a worn duffel bag and eyes that had seen too much for someone who looked barely 22. The Colorado sun beat down mercilessly as she joined the line of new recruits, all nervous energy and excited chatter. Unlike the others, Sarah moved with a deliberate quietness, her posture straight but not rigid, her gaze taking in everything without seeming to stare. The other cadets barely noticed her at first. She was average height, maybe 5'6", with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. Her uniform was crisp but not overly pressed, her boots broken in but well-maintained. Everything about her screamed unremarkable to the casual observer. This was exactly what Sarah intended. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife through butter. "Welcome to hell, maggots. You think you know what military training is? You think your high school wrestling team prepared you for this? Think again." His eyes swept over the group of 23 new recruits, lingering on each face with the practiced assessment of someone who had broken down thousands of young men and women before building them back up into soldiers. When his gaze reached Sarah, she met it steadily without defiance or fear. Rodriguez noted this, but moved on, already categorizing her as one of the quiet ones who would either wash out in the first week or surprise everyone by graduating at the top of the class. The initial processing took 3 hours: medical checks, paperwork, uniform distribution, and the assignment of bunks in the barracks. Sarah found herself in Delta Company, 3rd Platoon, surrounded by recruits who ranged from 18 to 25 years old. Some were fresh out of high school, others had tried college and decided the military offered better prospects. Her bunkmate turned out to be Jessica Chen, a talkative 19-year-old from California whose father had served in the Navy. "I'm so nervous," Jessica confided as they arranged their belongings in the small metal lockers beside their beds. "I've never been away from home this long. What about you? Where are you from?" Sarah folded her clothes with military precision, each item placed exactly where it belonged. "Texas," she said simply. It wasn't a lie, exactly. She had lived in Texas for 3 years during her childhood, among many other places. "Cool. What made you join the Army? Seemed like the right choice?" Sarah's answers were polite but brief, not unfriendly but clearly not inviting deeper conversation. Jessica got the hint and busied herself with her own unpacking. By evening, the social dynamics of the platoon had begun to establish themselves. There were the natural leaders like Marcus Thompson, a former college football player who had joined after his scholarship fell through. There were the followers who gravitated toward whoever seemed strongest. There were the loners who kept to themselves, and there were the troublemakers who seemed to view basic training as some kind of personal challenge to authority. Tommy Kowalski fell squarely into the latter category. At 24, he was older than most recruits and carried himself with the swagger of someone who thought military service was beneath his capabilities. He had joined after a series of dead-end jobs and minor legal troubles, seeing the Army as a last resort rather than a calling. During dinner, Tommy held court at one of the long metal tables, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about his civilian life that grew more impressive with each telling. "Man, if I hadn't gotten that bogus assault charge, I'd be managing my cousin's construction company right now," he said, stabbing at his mashed potatoes. "Instead, I'm stuck here with a bunch of kids playing soldier." His eyes fell on Sarah, who sat 3 seats down, eating methodically and quietly. She hadn't spoken to anyone during the meal except to say please and thank you to the mess hall staff. "Hey, Texas," Tommy called out. "You're awfully quiet over there. Cat got your tongue?" Sarah looked up from her tray, chewed and swallowed before responding. "Just eating." "Just eating," Tommy mimicked in a high-pitched voice that made his nearby followers snicker. "Come on, Texas, tell us about yourself. What's your story? Let me guess. Daddy was a soldier, and you're following in his footsteps?" Something like that, Sarah replied, returning to her meal. Tommy wasn't satisfied with the dismissal. He had already identified Sarah as an easy target, quiet, small, seemingly fragile. In his experience, people like that needed to be put in their place early or they would become problems later. Something like that, he repeated mockingly. Real talkative type, aren't you? I bet you cry yourself to sleep tonight missing Mommy and Daddy. A few recruits laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Jessica shot Sarah a sympathetic look, but remained silent. Sarah continued eating as if Tommy hadn't spoken. The lack of reaction only encouraged Tommy further. Oh, I get it, he said, leaning back in his chair with a grin. You're one of those types who thinks she's tough but has never been in a real fight in her life. Probably got picked on in high school and thinks the army is going to make her into some kind of badass. Sarah finished her last bite, picked up her tray, and stood to leave. As she walked past Tommy's chair, he stuck his foot out slightly in her path. It was subtle enough that it could have been dismissed as accidental, but Sarah stepped around it without breaking stride or acknowledging the attempted trip. Smart girl, Tommy called after her. Pick your battles. If only he knew how right he was and how badly he was about to pick his own battles. The first week of basic training was designed to break down civilian attitudes and begin building military discipline. Reveille at 0500, followed by physical training, breakfast, classes on military history and protocol, more physical training, lunch, weapons instruction, dinner, equipment maintenance, and lights out at 2200. The schedule was relentless and purposefully overwhelming. Sarah adapted to the routine with ease that surprised even the drill sergeants. While other recruits struggled to make their beds to military standards, hers were perfect from day one. While others fumbled with equipment or forgot protocol, she seemed to anticipate what was needed before it was asked for. During physical training, she kept pace with the strongest recruits without apparent strain. This only made Tommy's resentment grow. In his mind, Sarah was showing off, trying to make the rest of them look bad. He began making comments during training sessions, always loud enough for others to hear but quiet enough to avoid direct confrontation with the drill sergeants. Look at Miss Perfect over there, he would mutter during weapons cleaning. Bet she practiced this at home with Daddy's hunting rifle. Or during PT. Some people sure are trying hard to impress the drill sergeants. Wonder what she's compensating for? Sarah never responded to these provocations, which only fueled Tommy's determination to get a reaction. He began enlisting others in his campaign of harassment, convincing them that Sarah's competence was somehow a threat to their own standing in the platoon. She thinks she's better than us, he told Marcus Thompson during a cigarette break behind the barracks. You see the way she acts like this is all so easy? Like we're all just playing catch-up to her level? Marcus, who was struggling with some aspects of training himself, found the explanation appealing. Yeah, I noticed that too. It's like she's been doing this stuff her whole life or something. Exactly. Tommy seized on the observation. Normal people don't just walk into basic training and ace everything on the first try. Something's not right about that girl. The harassment escalated gradually. It started with verbal comments and social exclusion, but soon progressed to more direct actions. Sarah's equipment would mysteriously go missing and turn up in strange places. Her bunk would be accidentally messed up just before inspection. During group exercises, she would find herself partnered with the least competent recruits or excluded from informal study groups. Through it all, Sarah maintained her composure and focus. She never complained to the drill sergeants, never retaliated, never even acknowledged that anything unusual was happening. This restraint was born not from weakness or fear, but from a level of self-control that had been forged in situations far more dangerous than basic training harassment. Sarah Martinez was not who she appeared to be. Her real name was Sarah Collins, and before arriving at Fort Carson, She had spent 6 years as part of an elite special operations unit so classified that most military personnel didn't know it existed. She had completed missions in 13 countries across 4 continents. She had been shot twice, had survived torture during a capture in Eastern Europe, and had single-handedly extracted a diplomatic team from a collapsing embassy compound in Africa. But a mission gone wrong in Southeast Asia had left her with PTSD symptoms that made continued special operations work impossible. After 18 months of therapy and psychological evaluation, she had been given a choice: medical discharge with full benefits or a transfer to a regular military unit with a new identity and a clean slate. She had chosen the transfer, seeing it as a chance to rebuild herself and find a new purpose within the military structure she had served for most of her adult life. The cover story was simple and effective. Sarah Martinez was a 22-year-old from Texas with no prior military experience who had scored well on her aptitude tests. Her records showed an unremarkable background: high school graduate, some community college, various civilian jobs. Nothing to suggest that she was anything more than another young person seeking direction and opportunity in military service. The hardest part wasn't maintaining the cover story or pretending to learn things she already knew. The hardest part was resisting every instinct she had developed over years of training and combat experience. When Tommy Kowalski made his juvenile attempts to intimidate her, every fiber of her being wanted to respond with overwhelming force. She could have ended his harassment in seconds with techniques that would have left him unconscious on the floor, but that wasn't why she was here. She was here to learn how to be a regular soldier again, to find her place in the normal military hierarchy, and to prove to herself that she could function in a non-combat environment. Blowing her cover to deal with a small-time bully would defeat the entire purpose of her presence at Fort Carson. So she endured Tommy's escalating harassment with the patience of someone who had faced down trained killers in foreign jungles. She ignored the whispered comments and stolen equipment with the same composure she had once maintained while providing sniper cover for extraction teams. She treated basic training as just another mission, one that required a different kind of strength than she was used to demonstrating. But patience has its limits, even for someone with Sarah's level of training and self-control, and Tommy Kowalski was rapidly approaching those limits without realizing just how dangerous the game he was playing had become. The breaking point came during the 3rd week of training, during what should have been a routine field exercise. The platoon had been divided into 2 squads for a capture-the-flag-style training mission in the pine forests surrounding the base. Sarah found herself assigned to the squad that Tommy wasn't leading, which should have provided a temporary respite from his harassment. Instead, it gave him the opportunity he had been waiting for to escalate beyond verbal harassment into something more physical and dangerous, something that would finally force Sarah to reveal exactly who and what she really was. The forest was thick with lodgepole pines and underbrush, perfect terrain for military training exercises. Both squads had been given maps, basic equipment, and objectives that would test their ability to work as a team while navigating unfamiliar terrain. The drill sergeants would be monitoring from a distance, allowing the recruits to succeed or fail based on their own decisions and capabilities. Sarah's squad was tasked with defending a position marked by orange flags, while Tommy's squad attempted to capture it. The exercise was supposed to last 3 hours and end when one squad successfully completed their objective or time ran out. It was meant to be a learning experience about tactics, communication, and leadership under pressure. Tommy had other plans entirely, and he was about to learn that some people are far more dangerous than they appear to be. The morning air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles as both squads prepared for the field exercise. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez briefed them one final time before they dispersed into the forest. "This is about teamwork, strategy, and following orders," he announced. "No unnecessary roughness, no personal vendettas, and no heroics. You work as a unit, or you fail as a unit." Sarah's squad consisted of 8 recruits, including herself, led by Marcus Thompson, who had been chosen for his natural leadership abilities despite his recent alignment with Tommy's harassment campaign. The other members were Jessica Chen, David Park, Miguel Santos, Ashley Williams, Robert Johnson, and Kevin Murphy. They were a mixed group in terms of abilities, but most were earnest recruits who wanted to succeed. Tommy's squad had similar composition and numbers, but the dynamic was different. Tommy had somehow maneuvered himself into the leadership position despite not being officially appointed, and his followers were more interested in impressing him than in completing the mission successfully. This would prove to be a crucial weakness in what was about to unfold. The defending squad had 30 minutes to reach their designated position and establish a perimeter before the attacking squad began their advance. Sarah's team moved through the forest with reasonable efficiency, though their noise discipline was poor and their formation loose. Marcus called a halt when they reached the area marked by orange flags. "Okay, people," he said, consulting the map and compass they had been given. "We need to set up defensive positions around this clearing. Jessica and David, you take the north side behind those fallen logs. Ashley and Robert, take the south approach by those big rocks. Kevin and Miguel, you watch the eastern trail. Sarah, you're with me on the west side where they're most likely to approach from." Sarah nodded and followed Marcus to a position behind a cluster of pine trees that offered good cover and sight lines. As they settled in to wait, Marcus glanced at her with curiosity. Throughout the exercise planning, she had offered strategic suggestions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of tactics and terrain. Nothing that would raise suspicions about her background, but enough to make him wonder where a civilian had learned to think like a soldier. "You seem to know what you're doing," Marcus commented quietly, as they checked their sight lines and fields of fire for the paintball weapons they had been issued for the exercise. "Basic common sense," Sarah replied, adjusting her position slightly to minimize her profile while maintaining visual coverage of the approach routes. "High ground, cover and concealment, overlapping fields of fire. It's not complicated." But it was more complicated than Marcus realized, and Sarah's positioning was the result of years of combat experience rather than common sense. She had automatically chosen a spot that offered multiple escape routes, cover from multiple directions, and the ability to provide supporting fire to other positions. Her movements were economical and purposeful in ways that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with special operations experience. 20 minutes into their watch, Sarah heard the first sounds of Tommy's squad moving through the forest. They were making far too much noise, breaking branches and talking in voices that carried clearly through the trees. Either they were poorly trained in fieldcraft, or they were being deliberately careless. Given Tommy's personality and his obvious contempt for the exercise, Sarah suspected the latter. "Contact," she whispered to Marcus, pointing toward the sounds. "Multiple personnel, approximately 200 meters out, moving this direction along the main trail." Marcus peered in the direction she indicated, but couldn't see or hear anything yet. "How can you tell?" "Listen." Sarah cupped her ear and tilted her head slightly. "Rhythmic footsteps, multiple sets. Occasional equipment rattle. They're not trying to be quiet." Within 5 minutes, Marcus could hear what Sarah had detected much earlier. He quietly passed the word to the other positions that contact was imminent. Feeling a mixture of admiration and puzzlement at his partner's ability to gather intelligence from subtle environmental cues, Tommy's squad emerged into view shortly afterward, and their tactics were exactly what Sarah had expected. Direct assault, with no attempt at stealth or misdirection. Tommy himself was in the lead, carrying his paintball weapon like a trophy rather than a functional tool. His followers spread out behind him in a loose line that showed little regard for cover or mutual support. "This is going to be over fast," Marcus muttered, raising his weapon to engage the approaching squad. "Wait," Sarah said quietly. "Something's not right. Look at their positioning." Marcus looked again and saw what Sarah had observed. While Tommy and most of his squad were making a noisy frontal approach, 2 members had detached from the main group and were moving to flank the defensive position. It was actually decent tactics, though poorly executed. "Smart catch," Marcus admitted. "I'll alert the others." He began to move toward the radio they had been given for communication with other positions. But as he started to rise from cover, a paintball struck the tree inches from his head. Then another hit the ground nearby. Marcus dropped back down, confused. The attacking squad was still too far away for accurate fire, and the exercise wasn't supposed to begin until they received the official start signal. "What the hell?" Marcus said, looking toward Tommy's position. "Did they just—" 3 more paintballs impacted around their position in quick succession. These were deliberately aimed shots, not random fire. And they were coming from multiple directions, indicating that the flanking elements were also engaging before the official start time. Sarah's tactical experience kicked in automatically. This wasn't following the prescribed exercise parameters, and the pattern of fire suggested intent beyond simple eagerness to begin. Tommy was using the exercise as cover for a more personal agenda, and he had convinced his squad members to go along with it. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "I think we need to consider that this isn't strictly about the exercise anymore." More paintballs came their way, these ones closer and more accurate. One struck Marcus in the shoulder, leaving a large purple splatter. According to exercise rules, he was now dead and out of action. But since the exercise hadn't officially started, the hit shouldn't have counted. "Son of a bitch," Marcus said, looking at the paint splatter. "Tommy started early. We need to get word to the drill sergeants." Sarah was already thinking several moves ahead. If Tommy was willing to break exercise protocols this blatantly, he was likely planning something more serious than unauthorized early engagement. The isolation of the forest setting and the lack of immediate supervision created opportunities for the kind of harassment escalation that she had seen building over the past 3 weeks. "Radio the other positions," Sarah told Marcus. "Tell them to stay alert and follow proper safety protocols regardless of what Tommy's squad does." But as Marcus reached for the radio, more paintball fire erupted from the forest around them. Not just from Tommy's squad, but from multiple positions that suggested a coordinated assault on all the defensive positions simultaneously. Sarah could hear surprised shouts and return fire from Jessica's position to the north, and the distinctive sound of people moving rapidly through underbrush on the south side where Ashley and Robert were stationed. This was no longer a training exercise. This was Tommy using military equipment and isolated terrain to escalate his harassment campaign into something approaching assault. And he had no idea that his chosen victim was someone who had survived actual combat situations far more dangerous than anything he could improvise with paintball weapons and teenage followers. Sarah made a decision that would change everything that followed. She had spent 3 weeks enduring harassment and maintaining her cover identity as an unremarkable recruit. But allowing Tommy's escalation to continue could put other recruits in danger, and her first loyalty was always to protecting the innocent. "Marcus," she said calmly, "I need you to stay down and call for supervisor assistance. Tell them we have a safety incident with unauthorized engagement." "What about you?" Sarah was already moving, flowing from their covered position toward the source of the paintball fire with movements that seemed to make her nearly invisible among the trees. "I'm going to end this before someone gets seriously hurt." What happened next would become legendary among the drill sergeants at Fort Carson, though the official reports would be carefully edited to protect Sarah's cover identity. Years later, some of the recruits who witnessed it would still struggle to believe what they had seen. Tommy Kowalski thought he was hunting a frightened young woman through the forest with paintball weapons. In reality, he was about to encounter a predator who had been trained to neutralize threats in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The first sign that something had gone wrong with Tommy's plan came when his flanking elements simply stopped reporting in. Jake Morrison had been moving around the south side of the defensive perimeter when his radio went dead mid-sentence. Rick Valdez had been approaching from the east when he, too, went silent. "Jake, report," Tommy called into his radio. "Rick, what's your status?" Nothing but static. Tommy wasn't concerned initially. Radio communications in the forest could be unreliable, and his squad members weren't experienced with military equipment. He continued his frontal approach with the remaining 4 members of his squad, confident that superior numbers and aggressive tactics would overwhelm the defending position. That confidence lasted until he reached the clearing where Sarah and Marcus had been positioned, only to find it completely empty. No sign of the defenders, no indication of where they had gone, nothing but scattered pine needles and the faint impressions of where they had been lying in wait. "Where did they go?" asked Tony Chen, Jessica's older brother who had joined Tommy's unofficial alliance more out of sibling rivalry than genuine malice. Before Tommy could answer, Tony suddenly pitched forward with a grunt of surprise. A large red paintball splatter appeared on his back, directly between the shoulder blades. He spun around, trying to identify the source of the shot, but saw nothing but empty forest. "What the hell?" Tommy raised his weapon and scanned the trees around them. "Who's shooting? Show yourselves!" Another paintball struck the tree next to his head, close enough that he could feel the impact vibration through the bark. Then another hit the ground at his feet. The shots were coming from different directions, suggesting multiple shooters, but he couldn't see anyone. Tommy's remaining squad members began to panic. They had signed up for what they thought was a sanctioned bit of roughhousing disguised as a training exercise. They hadn't expected to find themselves in what felt like a real tactical situation with an invisible opponent who seemed to be picking them off one by one. "This is crazy," muttered Danny Rodriguez, no relation to the drill sergeant. "Where are they? How are they shooting at us without us seeing them?" Tommy was beginning to realize that he had seriously miscalculated something, though he still didn't understand what. The quiet girl from Texas wasn't supposed to be capable of this kind of tactical response. None of the recruits were supposed to have these kinds of skills. A voice called out from the forest, calm and conversational in tone. "Tommy, this is Sarah. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this exercise." Tommy spun toward the sound, weapon raised, but saw nothing. The voice had seemed to come from directly in front of him, but there was no one visible in that direction. "You started engaging before the official signal," the voice continued, now seeming to come from his left side. "You're also firing on positions that have already been cleared, which violates safety protocols." "Where are you?" Tommy shouted. "Stop hiding and face me like a soldier." "I'm not hiding, Tommy. You're just not very good at observation." The voice was now coming from behind him, and close enough that he spun around, expecting to see Sarah standing there. Instead, he found empty forest. The psychological effect was exactly what Sarah intended. Tommy and his remaining followers were beginning to understand that they were not in control of this situation, that they were facing someone with capabilities far beyond what they had expected, but they still didn't grasp the full extent of their miscalculation. "Last warning," Sarah's voice called out, though now it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "End this harassment campaign and return to proper exercise protocols, or I will end it for you." Tommy's response was to fire wildly into the trees, spraying paintballs in every direction while cursing loudly. It was exactly the reaction Sarah had expected from someone whose tactical thinking was driven by ego rather than training. When the firing stopped and Tommy paused to reload, Sarah stepped out from behind a tree that was less than 10 feet away from where he stood. She had been there the entire time, close enough to reach out and touch him, invisible simply because he hadn't known where to look. "Hello, Tommy," she said conversationally. Tommy's eyes went wide with shock and fear. Sarah's appearance was still unremarkable in most ways. Same average height, same regulation ponytail, same standard-issue uniform. but something in her posture and bearing had changed completely. She stood with the easy confidence of someone who owned the space around her, someone who had never doubted for a second that she could handle whatever threats emerged. "How did you—" Tommy started to raise his weapon toward her. Sarah moved with speed and precision that seemed to defy physics. One moment she was standing 10 feet away, the next she was beside Tommy with her hand on his weapon, redirecting it harmlessly toward the sky. Tommy found himself flat on his back in the pine needles with Sarah kneeling beside him, one hand maintaining control of his paintball gun, while the other rested lightly but meaningfully on his throat. "Listen carefully," Sarah said in the same conversational tone she had been using. "This stops now. The harassment, the deliberate rule violations, the attempts to isolate and intimidate other recruits, all of it stops right now." Tommy tried to struggle, but quickly realized that Sarah's grip was unbreakable despite her apparent lack of effort. "You can't," he gasped. This is you learning that some people are not what they appear to be," Sarah interrupted. "And you learning that actions have consequences even in basic training." She released him and stood up, stepping back to give him room to rise. Tommy scrambled to his feet, confusion and anger warring with the dawning realization that he had seriously misjudged his target. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I'm exactly who I've always said I am," Sarah replied. "A recruit from Texas who wants to complete basic training without unnecessary drama. The question is whether you're smart enough to let that happen." Around them, the forest had gone completely quiet. Tommy's remaining squad members had witnessed the entire exchange, and none of them seemed eager to continue the confrontation. The demonstration of Sarah's capabilities had been brief, but overwhelming in its implications. But Tommy's ego was still intact, and his understanding of what had just happened remained incomplete. He thought he had encountered unexpected resistance, not a trained killer who was showing remarkable restraint. He thought this was still a situation he could control through superior aggression and numbers. That misunderstanding was about to cost him dearly because Sarah's patience was finally approaching its absolute limits. Tommy Kowalski had always been the kind of person who doubled down when challenged rather than reconsidering his position. Standing in the pine forest with his weapon useless and his squad members looking uncertain, he made the worst possible decision he could have made. Instead of accepting the demonstration of superior capability and backing down, he chose to escalate further. "You think you're hot shit because you got lucky?" Tommy snarled, tossing aside the paintball weapon and clenching his fists. "Let's see how tough you are without tricks and hiding." Sarah observed his aggressive posture with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing a potential threat. Tommy was bigger than her by about 40 pounds and 4 inches, and he moved with the crude confidence of someone who had won most of his fights through superior size and willingness to inflict damage. In a fair fight between civilians, he would have significant advantages. Unfortunately for Tommy, this was neither a fair fight nor a fight between civilians. "Tommy," Sarah said calmly, "you really don't want to do this. Walk away. Take your squad back to base and report that the exercise ended early due to equipment malfunction. Everyone goes home without incident." "Screw that," Tommy replied, moving closer with his hands raised in a basic boxer's stance. "You embarrassed me in front of my guys. Nobody does that and walks away." The other members of both squads had begun gathering around the confrontation, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Jessica Chen was among them. Having left her defensive position when the shooting stopped, she watched with growing alarm as Tommy continued to advance on Sarah despite having just witnessed a demonstration that he was outclassed. "Sarah," Jessica called out, "just walk away. He's not worth it." But Sarah knew that walking away wasn't really an option anymore. Tommy had crossed the line from harassment into assault during the unauthorized engagement, and now he was escalating to physical violence. If she backed down now, he would only become more aggressive, and other recruits would eventually be hurt. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to remove their illusion of power completely and definitively. "Last chance," Sarah said to Tommy. "Stand down and return to base." Tommy's response was to throw a looping right hook aimed at Sarah's head, putting his full body weight behind the punch. It was a telegraphed attack from someone who relied on power over technique, exactly what Sarah had expected. What happened next took place so quickly that most of the watching recruits would later disagree about the sequence of events. Tommy's punch never came close to landing. Sarah moved slightly to the side, caught his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him face first into the nearest pine tree with a solid thud that echoed through the forest. Tommy bounced off the tree and stumbled backward, dazed but still upright. Blood trickled from his nose where it had impacted the bark. He shook his head to clear it and charged again, this time attempting a wrestling takedown that might have worked against another civilian. Sarah sidestepped the charge and applied what looked like a gentle push to Tommy's shoulder. The push was actually a precisely applied leverage technique that sent him tumbling into the underbrush with enough force to scatter pine needles and snap small branches. He rolled twice before coming to rest against a fallen log, groaning and struggling to regain his breath. "Stay down," Sarah advised. "This doesn't have to get worse." But Tommy's pride was now completely overriding his judgment. He pulled himself upright using the fallen log for support and reached into his pocket, producing a folding knife that he opened with a decisive snap. The blade was only 3 inches long, well within regulations for personal carry, but it transformed the confrontation from assault to armed assault. The watching recruits gasped and stepped back. Several of them began reaching for their radios to call for help, finally understanding that this had gone far beyond anything that basic training had prepared them to handle. Sarah's demeanor changed instantly. The conversational calm disappeared, replaced by something cold and focused that made even the uninvolved observers feel suddenly afraid. This was no longer a scuffle between recruits. This was a trained operator responding to a legitimate threat. "Put the knife down, Tommy," Sarah said, her voice now carrying absolute authority. "Put it down and step back, or you will be stopped." "Come and stop me, bitch," Tommy snarled, holding the knife in an overhand grip that revealed his complete lack of training with edged weapons. "Let's see how tough you are when I cut that pretty face of yours." He lunged forward with the knife raised, aiming for Sarah's upper body in a wild stabbing motion that left him completely off balance and exposed. For someone with Sarah's training, dealing with such an amateur attack was almost insultingly simple. Sarah caught Tommy's knife hand at the wrist, twisted it in a direction that human joints were not designed to move, and applied pressure to a nerve cluster that made his entire arm go numb instantly. The knife fell from his suddenly useless fingers as he screamed in pain and surprise. Before he could recover, Sarah had spun him around and applied a blood choke that cut off circulation to his brain. Tommy's struggles became weaker and more uncoordinated as his vision began to narrow and darken. Within seconds, he was unconscious and sinking to the forest floor. Sarah released the choke as soon as Tommy went limp, checking his pulse and breathing to ensure that he wasn't seriously injured. He would wake up in a few minutes with a headache and bruised pride, but no permanent damage. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds from the first punch to Tommy's unconsciousness. The forest was completely silent except for the sound of wind through the pine branches and Tommy's slow, steady breathing. Every recruit present stared at Sarah with expressions ranging from awe to terror, trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Is he?" Jessica asked quietly. "He's fine," Sarah replied, checking Tommy's pulse one more time. "He'll wake up soon. Someone should radio for medical evaluation just to be safe." Marcus Thompson, who had arrived during the confrontation, pulled out his radio with hands that shook slightly. "Base? This is Delta Company, 3rd Platoon. We need medical personnel at grid reference. He paused to check his map. Echo 7-4. One recruit unconscious but breathing normally. While they waited for medical response, Sarah gathered the scattered weapons and equipment, securing everything according to regulation. Her movements were efficient and professional, showing no sign of the adrenaline or emotional reaction that would be normal after a physical confrontation. "How did you do that?" asked David Park, voicing what everyone was thinking. Sarah looked up from organizing the paintball equipment. "Do what?" "All of it. The way you moved through the forest without being seen. The way you handled Tommy like he was a child. Where did you learn to fight like that?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading since arriving at Fort Carson. The demonstration she had just given would raise inevitable questions about her background and training. There was no way to explain those capabilities without revealing at least part of her true history. "I grew up in a rough neighborhood," she said, which was technically true. Some of the neighborhoods she had operated in during special missions qualified as very rough indeed. "You learned to take care of yourself." But the explanation satisfied no one, least of all Marcus Thompson, who had enough military experience in his family to recognize advanced combat techniques when he saw them. "That wasn't street fighting," he said quietly. "That was military training, special forces level stuff." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of medical personnel and drill sergeants. Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from a military ambulance followed by 2 medics and Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base training commander. "What happened here?" Rodriguez demanded, surveying the scene of scattered equipment, unconscious recruit, and nervous-looking trainees. Marcus stepped forward to deliver the report. "Drill Sergeant, the exercise became a safety incident when one squad began engaging before the official start signal. During the resulting confusion, there was a personal altercation that escalated to the use of an edged weapon. Recruit Martinez neutralized the threat and secured the area." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose as he processed this information. He looked from the unconscious Tommy to Sarah, who stood at attention beside the organized pile of equipment. "Recruit Martinez neutralized an armed threat?" "Yes." "Drill Sergeant, she disarmed and subdued Recruit Kowalski without causing serious injury." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her expression thoughtful as she studied Sarah more carefully. "Recruit Martinez, step forward." Sarah approached and saluted smartly. "Ma'am, walk me through exactly what happened from your perspective." Sarah delivered a concise and factual report of the events, omitting any details that would reveal her special operations background, but accurately describing Tommy's escalation from harassment to assault to armed assault. She concluded with the statement that she had used minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat and ensure the safety of other personnel. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the unconscious Tommy and the other recruits. When Sarah finished, Hayes asked, "Where did you receive training in hand-to-hand combat and weapons disarmament?" "I studied martial arts as a civilian, ma'am, self-defense courses." It was a reasonable explanation that would satisfy most questioners, but Hayes had 23 years of military experience and had seen every kind of training the armed forces had to offer. The techniques Sarah had demonstrated were not learned in civilian self-defense courses. They were advanced military combatives that took years to master and were only taught to elite units. "I see," Hayes said carefully. "We'll discuss your background more thoroughly later. For now, I want you to report to my office at 1400 hours for debriefing." The medics finished their evaluation of Tommy, determining that he had suffered no serious injuries beyond bruised pride and a mild concussion. He regained consciousness as they were loading him onto a stretcher, groggy and disoriented, but alert enough to understand what had happened. "She attacked me," Tommy mumbled as the medics secured him for transport. "I was just defending myself and she went crazy. Someone needs to arrest her." Rodriguez looked down at Tommy with obvious disgust. "Kowalski, you pulled a knife on another recruit during a training exercise. You're lucky you're not facing criminal charges along with immediate discharge. I'd keep my mouth shut if I were you." As the medical team departed with Tommy, the remaining recruits were ordered to return to base for individual debriefing. The field exercise was officially terminated, and formal investigations would begin immediately. Sarah found herself walking back through the forest alongside Jessica, who had been unusually quiet since witnessing the confrontation. "You're not really just a recruit from Texas, are you?" Jessica asked quietly. Sarah considered how to respond. The truth was impossible, but continued deception was becoming increasingly difficult. "I'm exactly who I've said I am. A person who wants to serve her country and complete basic training without unnecessary drama. But the way you fought, the way you moved through the forest like some kind of ghost, that's not normal training." "Everyone has a past," Sarah replied. "The question is whether we're going to let that past define our future, or whether we're going to build something better." It was a philosophical response that didn't answer Jessica's question, but acknowledged the deeper truth behind it. Sarah Martinez was indeed more than she appeared to be, but she was also genuinely committed to becoming the person her new identity represented. The formal investigation that followed would reveal Tommy's pattern of harassment and his escalation to assault and armed assault. He would be discharged from the military within a week. His brief career ended by his own poor judgment and inability to control his ego. Several of his followers would receive formal reprimands and additional training on military discipline and regulations. Sarah's background would be more carefully scrutinized by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and other senior officers, but her cover identity held up under investigation. The official record would show that she had acted appropriately to neutralize a threat and protect other personnel, using reasonable force in a dangerous situation. But among the recruits who witnessed the forest confrontation, Sarah's reputation was permanently altered. Word spread quickly through the training base about the quiet girl from Texas who had single-handedly ended a dangerous situation with skills that seemed to come from nowhere. Some recruits were intimidated and gave her a wide berth. Others were curious and tried to befriend her in hopes of learning more about her mysterious background. A few, like Jessica and Marcus, simply accepted that their fellow recruit was more complex and capable than she appeared, and treated her with the respect that such capabilities deserved. For Sarah, the incident represented both a failure and a success. She had failed to maintain the completely unremarkable profile she had hoped for, and questions about her background would continue throughout the remainder of basic training. But she had also proven to herself that she could function effectively in a regular military environment, protecting others without revealing more of her true identity than absolutely necessary. Most importantly, she had learned that building a new life didn't require completely abandoning the skills and experiences that had defined her old one. She could be Sarah Martinez, the quiet recruit from Texas, while still carrying the capabilities of Sarah Collins, the special operations veteran. The challenge was finding ways to integrate those two identities into a coherent whole. The remainder of basic training proceeded without major incident. Tommy's discharge and the formal reprimands issued to his followers sent a clear message about the consequences of harassment and assault. Sarah completed her training near the top of her class, her performance consistently excellent but not so outstanding as to raise additional questions about her background. On graduation day, as she stood in formation with her fellow graduates, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had entered basic training hoping to disappear into anonymity and rebuild herself as a regular soldier. Instead, she had been forced to reveal glimpses of her true capabilities and establish herself as someone not to be underestimated. But perhaps that was the real lesson of her experience at Fort Carson. True strength didn't come from hiding one's capabilities or pretending to be less than one was. True strength came from using those capabilities responsibly and protecting those who needed protection, regardless of the personal cost. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes approached her after the graduation ceremony, extending her hand in congratulation. "Well done, Martinez. You've shown remarkable potential during your training." "Thank you, ma'am." "I've arranged for you to be assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division at Fort Lewis. I think you'll find the assignment suitable to your particular talents." Sarah understood the implication. Hayes had seen through her cover story, but had chosen to support her transition rather than expose her. The assignment to Fort Lewis would place her in a unit that could make use of her special operations background without requiring her to reveal it completely. "I appreciate the consideration, ma'am." "One more thing," Hayes added quietly. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or trying to rebuild, remember that service is about more than individual achievement. It's about being part of something larger than yourself and protecting those who can't protect themselves." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." As Sarah watched her fellow graduates celebrate with their families, she realized that she had found something at Fort Carson that she hadn't expected, a new sense of purpose that integrated her past experience with her future goals. She was no longer just Sarah Collins, the burned-out special operations veteran, or Sarah Martinez, the unremarkable recruit from Texas. She was both and neither, a new person forged from the best elements of both identities. And for the first time in years, she was genuinely excited about what the future might hold. The quiet rookie, who had been picked on by cadets who had no clue about her true capabilities, had become something even more dangerous and valuable. A protector who knew exactly how much force was necessary and was prepared to use it when innocent people needed defending. Tommy Kowalski had learned that lesson the hard way, and it was a lesson he would never forget. But more importantly, Sarah had learned that she could honor both her past and her future by being exactly who she needed to be in any given moment, whether that was a quiet recruit or a highly trained operator. The Army had gained a soldier whose true value would only become apparent over time, as she proved again and again that the most dangerous people are often those who look completely ordinary until circumstances require them to be something else entirely.